So I've already interfaced my lining and my outer fabrics with ShapeFlex and Fusible Fleece, so let's get started sewing this together. I like to zigzag all around the pieces, the lining pieces and the outer pieces. It helps hold down the fusible fleece and crushes it down a bit so that it's easier to sew the seam allowances. I make sure that the zigzagging is within the 1/2 inch seam allowance that I use. And it also helps prevent fraying too. Now that we've got interfacing and have pressed all our pieces and zigzagged them, let's work on the zipper and the zipper tabs. This zipper is really long. I'm going to cut it down to 10 inches, which is the width of the top of my box pouch. I'm also going to mark the 1/2 inch seam allowance on it too. So if this is as far as you were going, you weren't going to put any zipper tabs on, you would just use these 1/2 inch seam allowances and keep your zipper this long. Of course, we are going to do zipper tabs for this pouch. So we're going to have to take a little bit more off of the ends of this zipper. For a 10-inch wide piece of fabric, we're going to want 8 inches of zipper teeth and 1/2 on each side to be covered by the zipper tab. And then of course then we have the 1/2 inch seam allowance on both sides that is completely empty, so we can sew it together. So here I've attached my zipper to my zipper tabs, and I've used a bit of Wonder Tape, and you can see I've got 8 inches of teeth and I've got 9 inches of zipper. And this is all going to be centered on the 10 inches of the box pouch so that the 1/2 inch seam allowances on both sides are left free. So the Wonder Tape is going to hold my zipper on the zipper tab as I sew, and I've already got my zipper foot on there because there's going to be a lot of need for it soon. And we're going to sew down a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so that's a really good guide for us when we're folding up the zipper tab and making the zipper tab. Now you can see my other side is already sewed on. Now the only thing left to do is to roll it up a 1/2 inch and roll it down a 1/2 inch and then fold it in half. And so that's why we have a 2-inch wide piece. I'm going to go press this too to help hold it in place. And then I'm going to use some Wonder Tape to make it stick down. And I'll do it on both ends. So now that we have our zipper tabs sewn on our zipper on both ends, we can attach our zipper to our pouch. And we're going to make sure it's centered, and we have our 1/2 inch seam allowances on both sides, and we do the right sides together. So flip the zipper over, and I'm going to use some Wonder Tape to hold it down, but you don't have to. Pins aren't that great, but clips work too. So just make sure it's nice and centered. And the edge of the zipper is against the edge of your fabric piece. Now we've got our first side sewn on, so let's do our other sides. Now we all know that I like to use Wonder Tape, so I'm going to put the Wonder Tape on the other side of the zipper tape now, and then I'll stick it to the other outer fabric. This stuff is easy. You just put it on like Scotch tape and peel off the back, and then you can flip it over and stick it to the other outer piece. Just make sure it's nicely centered. You have your 1/2 inch seam allowance on both ends, and the edge of the zipper tape is against the edge of your fabric piece. And I still have my zipper foot on, so it's easy to sew this on. Just watch out for your zipper pull because you don't want to run over it or make your seam line go crooked banging into it. So it's easier to put your hand in there and slip it out of the way. So now that we've got our outer pieces sewn onto our zipper, let's put our lining pieces on. I like to look at it first and see, yes, this is how I want it to look. So then I flip it over and I pinch together the seam that I'm going to sew together, and I get some clips out and I'll clip it up. Now you can see I've got my zipper and all my layers sandwiched between my outer layer and my lining layer that I'm going to sew up right now. So there's nothing special about sewing it on, just use a zipper foot of some sort. It's really helpful, and make sure you don't run over your zipper pull, so you might have to keep your needle down and lift your foot up while you move your zipper pull. And if I'm making one of fabric, I can backstitch, but if you're making something out of cork, you really shouldn't backstitch over it because it puts too many holes in the cork. So there's the outer layers all sewed on, and if we flip it over, you can see that I've got one side the lining sewed on. So let's sew on the other side of the lining now. That's the seam we just did. And this is what it's going to look like. So I place it down like usual, and then I flip it over and pinch the seam together, and that's what I'm going to clip together and sew. And again, you can see I've got the zipper and all the other layers sandwiched between my outer fabric and my lining fabric, and I'm going to sew this seam up. Looks like my zipper pull is in the way already, so I'm going to have to move that out of the way, obviously, and continue on sewing. And here we have all the layers done. Our two lining layers and our two outer layers, and now let's go press it so we can do some top stitching. Now this one is probably one of my favorite 2 feet for my sewing machine. This is a stitch in the ditch foot, and I use it with the needle in position as far to the left as it can go, and then that way I get a real uniform stitch that's 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. Now when it comes to top stitching, I don't like to put top stitching in the 1/2 inch seam allowance on both sides of my zipper. It makes it easier to turn your bag or your pouch if you don't have anything in the seam allowances. The other thing I'm going to try this time is I'm only going to top stitch just the one layer and see how that looks. I'm not going to top stitch the lining. So what do you think? How does that look? Both sides are top stitched, and I did leave the lining free on both sides, and I also didn't top stitch in the 1/2 inch seam allowance. So now we can sew our bag together. If we were just doing a pouch, not boxing the corners, I would pin the whole works together. But on this pouch, we're going to box the corners. So first, let's measure. On every single corner of every layer, we're going to measure a little square in the corner, and it's going to be 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. Now that will give us a 2-inch base on our pouch, because the 1.5 is actually 1/2 inch of seam allowance, so we're only adding in 1 inch on one side, 1 inch on the other side. So it'll be a 2-inch base on our pouch. Now I'm going to double check this again because, you know, I always check twice, and then I can cut it. And after I've cut the first one, I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to use that little square over and over again to measure all my other corners. And it's probably not something I recommend, but, you know, sometimes I cheat. So now we've got our 1.5 inch squares cut out of every single corner, and we can pin this all together. I'm going to pin it all around, but we're not going to sew it all around. And remember, we are pinning together the 2 outer layers and the 2 lining layers. Now when it comes to the zippers and the zipper tabs in things like this, there's always a big fuss about which way they should go. This time I'm going to push everything down towards the lining and have the zipper teeth facing up. So everything's going to be facing down except for the zipper teeth, just like if your bag was already turned, just how everything would be lying. The next thing I'm going to do is make sure I don't sew those zipper tab ends into my seam allowances, because that can pull your corners down too. So I'll make sure that my seam allowances are clear of everything, including the zipper tabs. And you can see I'm doing the other side exactly the same way. I'm going to have everything facing down towards the lining and the zipper teeth sticking out on top. And I'm going to make sure I don't sew in the zipper tabs. Now that everything's pinned together, I'm going to sew the sides up first. And I'm not going to sew those corners. I will sew the bottom here, which is the bottom of the outer layer, and I will sew the other side. Won't sew the corners, and I'll sew just a bit of the bottom of the lining, because we need an opening so that we can turn it. So be very careful going over where the zipper is. It might be kind of thick, and don't sew the zipper tabs into your seam allowance. Now there you can see I didn't sew the corners. That's the bottom of the outer layer. Now when it comes to the bottom of the lining, I'm just going to sew maybe an inch at the bottom, because I want to be able to leave it open in order to turn the bag. So we've left the bottom open so we can turn it, and we've left our corners unsewn. Sewed the side up, kept the tabs out. Corners unsewn, bottom sewn up. Looks like we're ready to tackle those corners now. Now the best way to get nice corners is to make sure when you pull them apart that your side seam and your bottom seam are lined up. And I usually have one facing one way and the other facing the other way. And then I pin it up and I sew my proper 1/2 inch seam allowance to close that opening. There, that's what the outer layer looks like. Now we can do the same thing with the lining layer. We open it up, we line up our bottom seam allowance and our side seam allowance, and it's a bit trickier because of the opening in the bottom, but we can do it. And then we pin it all and we sew it with the 1/2 inch seam allowance. There, now our lining bottom is boxed too. So now we put our hand in and we grab the base of the outer layer and we pull it through. And make sure you poke out those corners really nice, and poke out the corner where the zipper is on both ends. So now we can sew up the bottom of our lining, and I just turn the seam allowance into it. It's still 1/2 inch, and I pin it or clip it and I hand sew it. My hand sewing is done, so all I have to do is push the lining into the inside of the pouch, and I push the corners in really good too. So how do you like that? How did yours turn out? I'm working on a new pattern, and I've discovered a couple of other ways to make these nice corners on a pouch or a purse. So I hope to have that up here too very soon. So don't forget to subscribe and don't forget to like, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.